May 23, 1993. Madison Square Garden, New York City. 6:47 in the evening, Eastern Time, and the building was already generating its specific variety of noise. Not the roar that arrives when something happens, but the lower, older sound of an arena that has been anticipating something for days and has finally been granted permission to express it. The Garden held 19,033 people at full playoff capacity, and on this night the seats were occupied by a crowd that understood the sport at a cellular level, that had followed these Knicks through the winter and into the spring with the focused investment of people whose professional calendars had long since been reorganized around the team's postseason schedule. The floor had been laid Thursday and refinished Friday morning, and under the lights it held the sheen of hardwood, prepared for an occasion it understood was significant. The temperature in the building ran 4 or 5 degrees warmer than the street outside. On the bench at the far end of the floor, dressed in the charcoal road grey of the Chicago Bulls, Michael Jordan sat with a towel across his knees and watched the Knicks' introductions with an expression that suggested he had assessed each name as it was announced and filed the assessment in a location he intended to access later. He was 29 years old, the reigning back-to-back champion, and the team being introduced across the floor had spent the entire winter preparing a specific and anatomical argument for why none of that would matter tonight. The 1992 to 1993 New York Knicks had finished the regular season 60-22, the best record in the Eastern Conference, better than Chicago's 57-25, and they had arrived at this series carrying a confidence that was not the manufactured kind, not the public relations product of a franchise managing expectations. It was structural confidence, confidence built into the personnel, into the practice habits Phil Jackson's counterpart Pat Riley had installed over 3 seasons of deliberate construction. Riley had taken command of the Knicks in 1991 with a mandate that was simple and largely unspoken. Find players who understood that intimidation was a tactic, that physical dominance in the paint was a philosophy, that the way to stop a player of Jordan's dimension was not to outskill him but to make the experience of playing against you so consistently punishing that the cumulative toll changed what he could attempt and how often he attempted it. New York had Patrick Ewing at center, 7 feet 240 pounds, 11 seasons and 8 All-Star selections into a career that had broken the momentum of better teams than Chicago. They had John Starks, volatile and electrically gifted, whose competitive recklessness made him genuinely dangerous in ways that more polished players were not. They had Anthony Mason, thick and physical and difficult in every situation, requiring sustained body contact. They had Doc Rivers and Derek Harper at the point, experienced men who had navigated playoff basketball long enough to know which edges were negotiable. And they had Charles Oakley. Charles Oakley was 30 years old, 6 feet and 9 inches, and 245 pounds of consolidated professional intention. He had been drafted 9th overall in 1985 by the Cleveland Cavaliers, his rights traded immediately to Chicago, and he had spent 3 seasons alongside a young Michael Jordan as the Bulls' primary enforcer. The man whose specific responsibility was to make certain that no opposing player put hands on Jordan without consequence, and no opposing play ran through the paint without cost. They had been close. Jordan had protested when the Bulls traded Oakley to New York in 1988 for center Bill Cartwright, had said openly that he didn't understand the transaction, that Oakley was one of the people in the organization he most trusted, and the depth of his objection had been visible to anyone who followed the team closely enough to read past the official statements. That was 1988. By 1993, 5 years of playoff battles between these franchises had produced something that was not quite the opposite of friendship, but was functionally indistinguishable from it when the ball was in play. Oakley had developed, in the intervening years, what he described publicly in the language of property rights and territorial jurisdiction. His territory was the paint. The painted area of an NBA court measures 16 feet long and 12 feet wide, a total of 192 square feet of hardwood, and Charles Oakley had decided years before this series began that those 192 square feet belonged to him, that entry into that space carried a price, and that the price did not change based on who was presenting themselves at the gate. He had said so directly, in the flat declarative language that was his primary public register. He said that Jordan's job was outside, and that his was the paint. He said that some people had a lot of real estate and some had a little, and that the paint was his. He said that when you came into his territory he had to let you know. He said that Jordan understood the rules, that it wasn't about hurting anyone, but that when you entered the paint, you were going to pay the toll. These were not idle declarations. The documentation was available in any box score from any Bulls-Knicks playoff series between 1989 and 1993, in the bruises Jordan carried out of those games, in the technical fouls and flagrant foul assessments that appeared regularly in the officiating reports, in the physical altercation of February 1993, when Oakley and Jordan collided after a fast break basket, Jordan scratching his face and the officials ejecting Oakley while Jordan remained in the game, a decision the league reviewed for 2 days before fining Jordan and suspending him 1 game, the 3 officials having each independently determined they had not seen Jordan throw a punch in real time, a fact that said something about the velocity at which these 2 men conducted their interactions when proximity was forced. Oakley carried all of it into the 1993 Eastern Conference Finals with the equanimity of a man who had long ago decided that the distinction between friendship and competition was the most important distinction in professional sport, and that honoring the first required suspension during the second. Pat Riley had built his instruction around the principle that the pain Oakley could administer in the paint was a team resource, something to be deployed with the strategic intentionality of a coach who had studied Jordan more carefully than Jordan realized. Riley told his players, in the private candor of the locker room that found its way into documentary footage years later, that they could not allow Jordan to dunk on them, that each time he attacked the basket, they needed to meet him with a physical response that made the decision to drive again one that carried accumulating costs. He said that the Knicks had the personnel to execute this strategy. He said that the personnel included Oakley, Ewing, Mason, men whose combined weight and tactical commitment to physical enforcement could produce in Jordan the specific kind of wear that changes not what a player attempts, but what he considers attempting. The microsecond of deliberation that a player of Jordan's dimension inserts between the decision to drive and the execution of the drive when his body has learned, through repeated contact, that completion is not guaranteed. Riley said the objective was not to injure Jordan, it was to make him think. Jordan thought faster than almost any basketball player who had ever lived, but thinking still took time, and time in the terminal seconds of a playoff game was not available in surplus. The series opened at Madison Square Garden, and the Knicks won Game 1 90-88 and Game 2 96-91. 2 games played in the loudest arena in professional basketball. 2 games won by a team that had correctly identified the defensive premise required to be competitive against these Bulls, and the New York tabloid press arrived at the morning editions with the specific enthusiasm of a market that had been waiting for exactly this story. The back pages went up like signal flares. The Post and the Daily News and the other papers of the city turned their front pages and their sports sections into documents of municipal confidence, declaring in the large typographic language of New York City newspaper tradition what the results of 2 games had established, that the Bulls were vulnerable, that Jordan could be managed, that the dynasty had cracked, and that the team capable of ending it had always been right here in Madison Square Garden, and that the wait was apparently over. These pages were read in hotel rooms and on team buses, and in the specific quiet of the visitors' locker room at the Garden after losses, and they were read by the people they were intended to reach. Jordan read everything. He had constructed his entire competitive psychology on the deliberate accumulation of material that could be converted into energy, and the New York tabloid press was providing him with raw material of exceptional quality and quantity. He did not speak publicly about what he read. He was 30 years old and in his 9th season, and he had learned years before that the optimal response to public slights was not a statement, but a performance, and that the most devastating performances were not the ones delivered immediately, in the hot rush of reactive emotion, but the ones delivered after a period of cold accumulation, when the target of the performance was no longer certain, the accumulation had been occurring. The series moved to Chicago for Games 3 and 4. Jordan shot 3 for 18 in Game 3. His field goal percentage was 16.5%. He scored 22 points on 33 field goal attempts, a performance that the New York sports media characterized with the specific pleasure of confirmation, not cruelty exactly, but the satisfaction of people whose analysis had been validated by the available evidence. The tabloids that had celebrated the first two wins now celebrated the third win's supporting data. The narrative was established in print in the language of finality. Jordan was a shooting guard in his 9th season whose body had absorbed enough physical punishment from enough physical teams that the specific dimension of his offensive game most threatening to the Knicks, the drive into the paint, the attack on the basket, the forcing of contact from which he either drew fouls or converted through contact, had been effectively neutralized. Charles Oakley's real estate philosophy had been vindicated by the box score. This is the problem with vindication arrived at too early. It freezes the analysis at the moment of its production and does not account for what is being accumulated in the space it cannot see. May 31, 1993, Chicago Stadium, 7:43 in the evening. The building that had been Jordan's home for 9 years was full and in the particular register of noise that Chicago Stadium produced during playoff games, a sound that other arenas attempted to replicate and could not, partly because of the building's acoustical structure, partly because of the specific density of investment that Chicago crowds brought to Bulls home games in those years, the investment of a city that had waited a long time for something to celebrate and intended to celebrate it at every possible volume. The Knicks arrived for Game 4, having won 3 of 4 games in the series, 1 win away from eliminating the defending back-to-back champions on their home floor, and Oakley walked onto that floor with the same physical certainty he brought to every game, the certainty of a man who had spent 3 weeks executing a defensive strategy that had produced the desired results and had no reason to believe the 4th game would produce different ones. Jordan had taped his wrists in the locker room, left wrist first, then right, pulling the tape with a tension that his trainers had learned not to interpret as a request for conversation. He had been in the building for 2 hours before tip-off. He had gone through a shooting routine in the back gym that lasted 40 minutes, repetition after repetition from the spots on the floor he visited when he wanted to understand something. And what he was trying to understand that afternoon was not the mechanics of his shot, which had not changed, but rather the patience required to deliver it in the circumstances it would need to be delivered. He had a theory about Game 4. The theory was that the Knicks had spent 2 weeks studying one version of Michael Jordan, the Jordan who drove into the paint, who sought contact, who converted through the collision, and had prepared their physical enforcement strategy for that version with thoroughness and expertise. The theory was that a different version existed. The theory was that the Knicks had not prepared for 54 points. The number is worth dwelling on before describing how it arrived. 54 points in a playoff game is not a statistic that arrives through luck or through the benign cooperation of a defense that fails to show up. It requires field goal attempts. Jordan was 18 for 30 from the floor, a shooting percentage of exactly 60% on 30 attempts. Say it requires free throws. Jordan was 12 for 14 from the line, attempts that represent contact, contact that represents drives, drives that went into the paint where Charles Oakley and Patrick Ewing and Anthony Mason were waiting with their enforcement philosophy. It requires sustained engagement through all 4 quarters of a playoff game against the best defensive team Jordan had faced since the Detroit Pistons, sustained engagement across 2 hours of game time against a defense that had been preparing for this exact confrontation for 9 months of regular season and 2 weeks of playoff analysis. 54 points in those conditions against that defense in a game the Bulls needed to win to extend their season was not a statistic that arrived. It was a decision that arrived, and then was executed with a precision that made the decision and the execution appear to be the same thing. In the first quarter, Jordan found his rhythm early. He attacked the paint twice in the opening 4 minutes, drew contact from Oakley both times, converted the shots and made the free throws. Oakley absorbed the contacts with the professional patience of a man who understood that the toll was structural. You paid it going in, and you paid it going out, and the payment was the point, not the individual transaction, but the cumulative account. The Knicks' defense was executing the principle Riley had installed. Jordan was going to the basket and being met with force and being made to earn every point with his body, and the theory was that this was acceptable, that the accumulation of physical cost would eventually change what Jordan decided to attempt. The theory was correct about bodies in general. It had been formulated without adequate account for Jordan's specifically. By the second quarter, Jordan had adjusted not his intentions but his geometry. He was finding the ball at positions on the floor where Oakley's enforcement required him to travel further than his instincts preferred, positions where the angle of the drive and the position of the paint and the location of Ewing's help defense created a mathematics that favored Jordan's mid-range jumper over Oakley's patrol range. He was not avoiding contact. He was selecting the contact that served his purposes. There is a version of physical defense that is designed to make a player stop attacking, and there is a version that is designed to make a player less efficient when he attacks, and these are different things. And the difference matters most when the player being defended has the specific quality that Jordan possessed: the ability to locate the version of the game being played against him and respond not with the move that feels most natural, but with the move that the defense has not prepared for. He scored 21 points in the first half on 10 of 15 shooting. Pat Riley called 2 timeouts in the second quarter with the intention of communicating adjustments, and the adjustments were communicated, and Jordan absorbed the adjustments and filed them. And in the third quarter, he scored 17 more points on 7 of 12 shooting. Oakley was covering him physically through all of it, maintaining the enforcement discipline that had produced 3 wins in the series. The contacts were real. The toll was being paid. The account that was being opened in Jordan's interior ledger was filling with every collision, every forearm across the chest, every body check in the lane that sent him sideways after the shot went up. And the contents of that account were not rage exactly, because rage requires a loss of precision, and what Jordan was experiencing produced the opposite: a sharpening, a narrowing, a compression of all available attention into the single instruction. Make them pay for every physical statement they have made about you for the last 9 months. He finished the game 18 for 30 from the floor, 12 for 14 from the free throw line. 54 points, the most points ever scored against the New York Knicks in a playoff game. Jordan did not gesture toward the Garden crowd after the final buzzer. He did not locate Charles Oakley on the floor and communicate anything about the evening's accounting. He walked toward the locker room tunnel with the forward-facing economy of a man who has completed a piece of work that was always going to be completed and has moved his attention to what comes next. Game 5, June 7, 1993. Madison Square Garden again. The Knicks had won the first 2 games at home and lost the next 2 in Chicago, and the series had resolved into the specific geometry of a best-of-7 that was now a best-of-3, and the 2 remaining home games for New York were games 5 and 7 if a 7th game was required, which meant the Knicks needed to win tonight. The Garden still had its 27-game home winning streak. The crowd that arrived for Game 5 arrived with the particular quality of urgency that distinguishes must-win games from any other variety. Not the confidence of a team that expects to win, but the compressed necessity of a crowd that understands losing this game is an outcome with permanent implications. Jordan had 30 points in the first half. He was scoring in every way available: in the post at the elbow, at the three-point line where his shot selection was more aggressive than his reputation as a shooter suggested, through contact in the lane where Oakley and Ewing and Mason were conducting their physical policy as programmed. The Knicks led at halftime, and they led in the fourth quarter, and the game moved into its final minute with New York ahead by 1. Jordan had not been dominant the way the 54-point performance in Game 4 had been dominant. He had been present, which is a different quality, and in certain circumstances, the more important one. He had been the person on the floor in the fourth quarter who most often had the ball when something critical needed to happen, not because the play was drawn for him every time, but because the gravitational pull of a critical situation in a playoff game and the gravitational pull of Michael Jordan's proximity to the ball were 2 forces that had long since stopped being distinguishable. With a minute left and New York ahead, the Knicks had the ball and the crowd had begun its anticipation of the outcome that the arithmetic suggested was coming. Jordan was defending on the perimeter, his body low, his weight distributed in the specific way it was distributed when he had identified the possession as one that mattered more than the possessions preceding it. The Knicks ran their offense. Doc Rivers brought the ball up, found Starks on the right wing. Starks worked against Jordan, pump-faked, came down, and chose to throw it to Ewing at the top of the key rather than force a difficult shot. Ewing received the ball with Patrick Ewing's particular authority, 7 feet, 240 pounds, 8 All-Star games, a career's worth of evidence that he could impose himself on this game in the moments the game required it. He drove toward the basket. The Bulls' defense rotated. Ewing's path closed. He found Charles Smith near the baseline, a forward who had scored efficiently earlier in the game, a competent professional in his second season with the Knicks, who was in exactly the right position at exactly the right moment, that the right position and right moment had been built into the play for him to occupy. What happened next occurred in 5 seconds. Charles Smith received the ball 4 feet from the basket. The shot was available. He went up for the layup. Horace Grant arrived from the weak side and blocked it. Smith recovered the ball. He went up again. Michael Jordan, arriving from the help side with the lateral quickness that 11 seasons had not diminished, stripped the ball from Smith's hands as it began its arc. Smith recovered again. The ball was still live, still in his possession, still in the painted area that Charles Oakley had spent years identifying as territory with a toll. Scottie Pippen came from behind. Block, Smith again, Pippen again. Block. 4 consecutive shot attempts by a professional basketball player in an uncontested position under the basket, in the final seconds of a game his team needed to win, and 4 consecutive acts of collective defense by a Bulls team that had been told by the world for 2 weeks that it was finished, that the Knicks' physical superiority had established a permanent new order of things, that Jordan could be managed, that the paint was Charles Oakley's real estate, and the toll was real and the deed was filed. Grant recovered the ball after the 4th block. He passed to Jordan. Jordan found B.J. Armstrong in space. Armstrong laid it up as the clock expired. Bulls 97, Knicks 94. The Garden went silent in the specific way that very large rooms go silent when the thing that was supposed to happen has not happened, and the thing that was not supposed to happen has, the silence of 19,000 people recalibrating simultaneously, processing the gap between what the arithmetic had suggested was coming and what had arrived instead. In the Knicks locker room, the quality of the silence was different. Charles Smith sat near his locker for a long time. He had come within the distance of completing a layup of sending his team to a 3-2 series lead, and he had done it 4 times and been stopped 4 times, and the experience did not fit into any of the frameworks available for processing athletic failure, because the frameworks generally assumed that failure came from a single missed opportunity rather than from the systematic negation of an uncontested position at the basket. He said afterward that he would not have done anything differently. He said he kept attacking. He said the question of whether he had been fouled was one the replay could answer. What he did not say, because the language for it did not exist in the post-game availability, was the interior experience of watching the ball leave his hands 4 consecutive times in the direction of the basket and be returned to him 4 consecutive times by the same hands that had spent the past 2 weeks being told were no longer capable of the thing they had just done. Oakley was direct in the aftermath, as he was always direct. He said that Ewing should not have passed the ball out of the double team. He said the Knicks had not executed. He said the same things to the reporters that he had been saying all series about the paint being his territory, about the toll, about the price of admission, with the pragmatic consistency of a man who believed in the principle and did not require the principle to have produced the result in order to continue believing in it. But there was something the principle could not account for, something that had been visible across 5 games, and most specifically across the final 5 seconds of Game 5. And Oakley, who had spent 3 seasons alongside Jordan and had spent 5 more seasons applying his best thinking to the problem of stopping him, understood it without needing to articulate it. The principle that physical enforcement could change what Jordan chose to attempt assumed that Jordan's choice architecture included the option of choosing not to attempt. The evidence of 5 playoff games, including one in which Jordan had scored 54 points against the most physically prepared defensive team he had faced in years, suggested that the option did not exist in Jordan's system. The alternative to attempting was not available to him as a selection. What Oakley's philosophy had encountered in the paint was not a player who could be taught to think before driving. It was a player who had located thinking and driving in the same neural instruction, a player for whom the calculation of whether to attempt was identical with the attempt itself, and who had therefore been applying the toll to his own body, not as a cost to be weighed, but as a resource to be converted. The Bulls won Game 6 in Chicago 96-88 and eliminated the Knicks. Jordan finished the series with averages of 32.8 points, 10 rebounds and 6 assists, having done his responding not in a press conference or an interview, but in the only language that carried any permanent weight in the economy of professional sport. The tabloids that had printed the back-page celebrations of the first 2 wins filed their follow-up stories. The franchise that had the best record in the Eastern Conference went home without a championship for the 5th consecutive season. And Charles Oakley, who had enforced his real estate philosophy with everything available to him, absorbed the series result with the specific equanimity of a man who understood the distinction between executing a sound principle and producing the outcome the principle was designed to produce. The principle had been sound. The execution had been professional. The opponent had simply operated outside the reach of what the principle could contain. Jordan went on to the finals and won his 3rd consecutive championship, completing the first three-peat of his career. He retired 3 months later, cited a loss of desire, and the world spent years arguing about whether the retirement was voluntary or otherwise. What the 1993 Eastern Conference Finals left in the permanent record was simpler and less contestable than any of those arguments. Oakley had identified the paint as his territory. Jordan had gone into the paint anyway, repeatedly, through 5 playoff games and across 48 minutes of deliberate physical enforcement, and had produced 54 points in a single game and a series result that removed the Knicks from the postseason. He had not avoided the toll. He had paid it every time, in full, without modification of intent, and had made the payment itself into the argument. What he left behind was not a demonstration of his superiority over Charles Oakley. Oakley was one of the finest power forwards of his era, and the confrontation between them was as complete and serious as professional basketball could produce. What he left behind was a demonstration of what happens to a philosophy of deterrence when it encounters a competitor who has removed deterrence from his operating system. The toll was real, and Jordan paid it every single time and kept driving. This is the principle that transcends the sport and the decade and the specific geography of Madison Square Garden in the summer of 1993. The people who change outcomes in the highest stakes situations of any field are not the ones who have found a way to avoid the cost of attempting difficult things. They are the ones who have restructured their relationship to that cost so fundamentally that paying it and attempting the thing have become the same act. The territory of difficulty belongs to whoever is willing to pay the toll and proceed. The people who understand this, who have absorbed it past the level of intellectual acknowledgement and into the operating architecture of their behavior, will always find a way through the paint.